Good morning and namaste, all of you. Thank you for coming this very cold morning. So it's wonderful to see all of you here. Um, we are very excited to present this first Vedanta Symposium. Just a couple of lines about the Vedanta Center of Ann Arbor. It's a registered nonprofit spiritual organization in the state of Michigan. Our primary activity is to present talks and retreats by visiting monks from the Vedanta societies and Vedanta centers across the US and occasionally from visiting monks from India as well. We have a regular reading series that we hold in the downtown public library. We read various Vedanta texts and discuss. So if you'd like some information, please do let us know. There is an email sign-in sheet. If you would like to be on the mailing list, please do so. Also, these events are free, but we do have some expenses. So if you would like to, please make some donations. There's a box there. We would appreciate that. So we will start the symposium now. The first speaker is the very distinguished Swami Tyagananda ji. He has been a monk of the Ramakrishna order since 1976 and is the head of the Vedanta Society in Boston and the Hindu chaplain at Harvard and MIT. Prior to coming to the United States, Swami Tyagananda was the editor of the English language journal Vedanta Kesari for 11 years, based in Chennai, in India. He has written, translated, and edited many books, including Monasticism, Ideals and Traditions, Values, The Key to a Meaningful Life, The Essence of the Gita, and Interpreting Ramakrishna, Kali's Child Revisited. He is currently writing a series of commentaries on the 4 yogas of Swami Vivekananda. The first volume, Walking the Walk, a manual of Karma Yoga, appeared in 2013. The second volume, Knowing the Knower, a manual of Jnana Yoga, appeared in 2017. Today, Swami Tyagananda ji is going to talk about practicing Vedanta in daily life.
Want me to put this, right? Not now? I can speak into it, no problem. Yeah, I'll begin with a short prayer. Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravir Mayedhi Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the divine consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. So my topic is practicing Vedanta in daily life. So what I would like to do in the next few minutes is just to begin by something about the study of Vedanta, what it involves, why it's important, and how study and practice are connected. One of the first things that we all learn for any kind of study, secular or spiritual, is that there are no shortcuts. There is a story about Euclid, the father of geometry. It seems that he always insisted on a thorough study of the geometric principles in order that his students might fully understand them. And then the king of Alexandria, we read, once expressed his impatience at Euclid's elaborate manner of explaining his theorems. And the king then asked him, isn't there a shorter way to learning geometry than through your very elaborate method? And then Euclid replied, Your Highness, in the country there are two kinds of roads, the harder road for the common people and the easy road for the royal family. But in geometry, all must go the same way. There is no royal road to learning. So when someone decides to learn Vedanta, what does that learning imply? First of all, is there even need to study? For those who turn to spiritual life, those who want to practice Vedanta, for instance, is how important is learning itself? And that's not a question easy to answer because we find those whom we see as enlightened beings spiritually were not necessarily all scholars. So it's very difficult to know whether intellectual understanding is an absolute necessity for spiritual enlightenment. We also read in the texts themselves, in the Vivek Chodamani of Shankaracharya, for instance, we see about the dangers involved in study as well. Shabdajalam, Maharanyam, etc., that sometimes it's possible to get lost into these words and ideas, and we might have a lot of ideas, know a lot of things, read a lot of books, and yet when we look back and say, what do I really know? We might discover that probably not much. And yet, in spite of all these possible dangers in study, there are also clearly many benefits that come. The first benefit is clearly it removes many of the doubts and questions that any student has. It also can, for a spiritual seeker, study can protect them from many of the unfavorable influences in life. By unfavorable, I mean there can be things that can detract us from the ideal we have before us. A study, even an intellectual study, can keep us tethered to the goal and prevent the mind from getting distracted. It also has the potential to systematize our thinking processes. It doesn't happen on its own clearly, but if we study in the way we should study, we study in an ideal way, then it can help to systematize our way of thinking. And sooner or later, we all realize that it's not enough to have a lot of ideas. All of those ideas must somehow fit well. We know how these ideas should connect and interconnect with one another. In that instance, Vedanta teachers have often said that all the concepts we have are kind of pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And only if those pieces are put in the right place, we have a beautiful picture. Otherwise, they could all be scattered everywhere, and then rather than being any help, they can become a burden. So that's one thing about systematizing our thinking processes. Although we sometimes tend to refer to some people as thinkers, which is a little bit misleading, which might make us think that others don't think, which is not really true. Every one of us thinks. The only difference is those whom we recognize as thinkers are the ones who are able to do it in a disciplined way. They have these ideas and they know how those ideas are linked and how they form a beautiful picture. That's the only difference. Study also helps us to, or I keep on saying has the potential because it doesn't happen automatically, but study has the potential to help us distinguish or separate the essentials from non-essentials. And finally, it provides us a nourishment to the mind and the intellect. So the importance of study, for those of us who have undertaken study of any kind, really, it can never be overstated. But a study of a secular subject and a study of a Vedanta or study of spiritual life has some distinctions. And one of it is that in order for a study to be not only enrich our intellectual life, but also have a transformative effect on us, it must be a goal oriented. And study of Vedanta, which is what really I want to focus on primarily, is based on a strong moral foundation. So unless a student is rooted in some of the basic values, such as truthfulness, honesty, unselfishness, the study won't really um, flower in the fullest possible way. One of the important requirement for study is a judicious selection of what to study, selection of books. Nowadays, there's so many books, and really you don't really need books anymore. You just need an access to the internet, and it's easy to be overloaded with too much information and not having the ability to recognize which of that information is really needed or good or even accurate. And therefore, being judicious about what we read is important in Vedanta study and practice. And that is because we know even the material things that we possess, sometimes it's very difficult to get rid of it, even if we know we don't need it. And that's why sometimes our garages and basements get just filled with stuff we have never used and never even think, but it's very difficult to throw it away. Throwing away useless ideas is even more difficult. And therefore, if there's junk put inside us, to get rid of it, it may be possible in a fiction. In Harry Potter, you can have some ideas taken out and throw it away or something like that. But you can't do it in real life. That becomes a real. So oftentimes, many of us will have realized that learning itself is not as difficult as unlearning. And so, if we are more judicious in what we study and how we study, the unlearning process will be minimized. And study, if study is adhyayana or adhyaya, oftentimes the word that gets used in Vedanta tradition is swadhyaya. And so it's not simply study of books, it's study of books as applied to one's own specific situation. And I think that is probably the most important thing in a study of Vedanta. Clearly, it's possible to study Vedanta as a completely academic exercise. It's possible to do a PhD in the Upanishads and some specific branch. It's possible to do that and yet not have anything changed in a substantial way, unless and until what we study is directly related to one's own specific situation and say, well, if this makes sense to me intellectually, how can I put it into practice? And I think that's the crux of Vedantic study. Now, in the Vedic system of education, clearly it was very different from the type of education we have today. For one thing, they didn't have schools to go to the way we understand the term schools today. Usually the student had to go to the teacher's place, the teacher, and almost become a part of the teacher's family. It's called Guru Griha Vasa. And then the teacher and the relationship between the teacher and the student was just between as a parent and a child. And then the teacher could assess at what level the student was, give the student a first lesson in something. And usually in the Vedic system, the first lesson that was given was always the teaching of the Gayatri prayer. And the prayer of Gayatri was primarily Dhiyo Yonah Prachodayat, for the opening up of this deeper, clearer level of the intellect. Because if once the mind is ready and clear, then whatever we put into the mind will be able to understand and not misunderstand. Swami Vivekananda once famously said that if I had to begin my education all over again, I would not read any books at all. So he said, I would first spend the time in training of the mind. And once the mind is trained, then whatever it is that I want to learn, I just have to put the mind there and then learn. Unfortunately, we can't do that today. none of us has the power and the ability to change the system. So the present system now, we are really burdened with lots of ideas, lots of, I think, sometimes even in my life, I see what I knew when I was very young child and what the children of the present generation see. There's so much, these children know a lot more than what I knew at that age. I don't know whether that's a blessing or not, because sometimes I feel that we have a lot more information, but not enough ability to process that information, to know what to do with that information. So sometimes it's probably not a great blessing to know a lot of things, enough probably to know little, but to know exactly where it fits into my life and how I can put it into practice. So in the Vedic period, what the teacher did was gave the first lesson. And then the student was expected to then live according to that. First of all, understand it, and then try to put it into practice. When we put that into practice, in addition to the intellectual understanding, we get that knowledge which comes from a directly experiencing or experiencing what has been learned in a classroom. Now that experience increases our level of the capacity of the mind to be ready for the second lesson. And then when that practice is done, then the teacher gives the second lesson. And then once again, so the theory and practice kept in step with one another. And that led to a more wholesome kind of an education. And that's unfortunately not possible today because of easy access to books. So we don't even need a teacher. A lot of time people ask whether a teacher is even needed because there is very easy access. So we can read a lot, we may not always be sure whether we have understood it properly or misunderstood it. And in that sense, therefore, I see that reading about Vedanta from books, what we get from books are more general principles. And to change or to transform principles into practice, that is the challenge. And if we are able to do it ourselves, that's the best thing that can happen. But sometimes we have become so lazy nowadays that we always want even the practice to be spelt out by someone else. Not just in spiritual life. I mean, for instance, the enormous popularity of, say, Dale Carnegie's book, like How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's been a kind of all-time classic. And it's very helpful. It's an amazing book. It's very, very helpful, no doubt about it. But also, what it does is how to books. It's some of the basic principles about human relationships. So here is this really great author with great tips, tells us then what I should do in life to win friends and influence people. And many people have read that, understood it, followed it, and tried to benefited by it. There's one sentence in that book which I truly like, and I think Dale Carnegie says something like this. He said that the reader should remember that I'm not presenting here a bunch of tricks for them to be able to win friends. Here, and I don't remember the exact words he uses, but something like this has somehow to become a part of our life, the way we think, the way we do. Only then this will truly work. And that's true with Vedanta as well. So they say, sa vidya ya vimuktaye. Knowledge, if it is knowledge, it is something that truly frees us. There is much that can be said about freedom, but I would like to just use the word freedom in a more spiritual sense. Clearly, I mean, knowledge does free us from ignorance at various levels, but the deepest ignorance that Vedanta speaks about, the ignorance about just the purpose of life, ignorance of just who I am, what am I doing here for? Did I exist before I was born? Would I continue to exist after I die? And so on. So to know about it not simply from books, but actually from our own life. And that's why, just as we have pure mathematics and applied mathematics. So we speak about science and technology. What we see in pure sciences would be just the principles. And only when we apply those principles in a specific ways, then it becomes technology. So similarly, study of Vedanta would be a little bit like that. We have to study from the texts. We can study from not just text. We can study from others who can share their knowledge through their own experience about Vedantic principles. But after we get these principles, only when we apply it to our own specific situations, then it becomes a swadhyaya. And then I need to say that if this makes sense to me, waking up tomorrow morning, how can I actually put it into practice? And one of the things that Vedanta teachers often recommend is not to think that everything that we read or everything that we hear about necessarily has to be relevant to us today. There may be many things that we study which may not seem to be immediately relevant, which is okay. Everything doesn't have to be relevant. But just because it's not relevant to me now doesn't mean it won't be relevant to me 10 years from now. And so it's good to know, but see what's relevant to us in our present situation and put it into practice. With that in mind, I would just like to mention just 3 or 4 things. For instance, in the study of Vedanta, the practice of detachment often gets emphasized. In fact, Vivekananda said that the central characteristic of Krishna's life and what he taught in the Gita, according to some, could be the detachment. Now, the word detachment can easily get misunderstood because it's a word that we used in common conversations as well. Detachment primarily is an internal thing, detaching the ego from the things that it appropriates, to kind of separate ourselves from things that trap us, so to speak. So if the practice of detachment, or whatever we have read about it in books and heard about it, seems to make a sense, seems to be a quality or a virtue worth cultivating in our lives, then we have said, well, what can I do actually in more concrete terms to be able to practice detachment in life? And so applying that principle, one of the ways of making that practical in our daily life would be, for instance, doing all the good we can, but not remembering it. And that needs detachment. Because sometimes most of us are good people. Most of us do good things. We help people. But after helping them, we just cannot forget about it. We just feel good about it when we help other people. But what happens is when we remember our own goodness, we just carry it with us everywhere. It does set up, besides making us vain and maybe boosting our ego, oh, nobody's as good as I am. I'm so helpful. I'm so wonderful. But besides that, it can also set up a chain of expectation that you are good to someone. When someone is in need, a friend of yours is in need, and you help that person, and you remember that you have helped that person. And the next time you are in need, and then this same person you help doesn't help you, you feel even more hurt. Because like, I helped this person, but this person didn't help me back. And this happened because I could not forget my own good deed. So detachment, if I want to then practice detachment, would mean to doing all the good I can, but then forgetting about it. So living without any expectation of any kind. It's tough. And everyone of us says about, well, I want to be happy. Well, no sane person in life would want to be miserable. But really, in many ways, it's not that difficult to be happy. And one way would be to just ask myself, what kind of expectations I have in life? Is it possible for me to do always what is right, to do always what is good, and not expect anything from anyone because of this firm conviction that what I deserve will automatically come to me no matter what? Because we know that expecting or not expecting doesn't change the outcome in any way. For instance, now, this town is so much well known for your football game. And you always want your fans, if you're a fan of your team, you'd always expect your team to win. Now, if the team is going to win, it'll win. If it's not going to win, it's not going to win. Your expectation is not going to change the outcome at all. And therefore, expecting anything is a totally useless activity. But a true student then would be able to look deeply and say, I'm not going to expect because what will happen will happen. In fact, there is a verse in a text called Panchadashi, which goes a little bit like this. It goes, Yat abhavi natad bhavi, bhavi chet natad anyatha, iti chinta vishaknoyam bodho brahmanivartakaha. Which simply means this: what is going to happen will happen. What will not happen will not happen. Knowing this, wise ones become free from the poison of anxiety and free from all delusion. It's simple, it's basically common sense. You don't really need the book to know this. That what will happen, what will not happen, will not happen. And if the more we are able to cultivate this attitude in life, the less of a stress and anxiety we will have. And that's what I mean by transforming principles into actual techniques, something that we all can practice. So this is one kind of a practice for a Vedanta student, to not expect anything from anyone. And one way of concretely doing it is to do all the good you can, to carry out all the duties and responsibilities you have towards your family, towards your friend, towards your country, but don't expect anything back, because what you will get, you will get. What you won't get, you won't get. What would be a little bit more difficult would be not just forgetting all the good that you have done to other people, but forgetting all the bad that others have done to you. And that can get even more tough. And so practice of detachment would include not carrying this grudge and hatred and anger, because it hurts us more than it hurts the other person. And sometimes it carries over generations. It's not just that someone has hurt me. Your dad did this to my dad, or your grandfather did this to my grandfather. And sometimes for generations together, people can remain alienated. And that just goes to prolong the suffering. Practice of discernment, often called viveka in Sanskrit. One of the things that we will see if we look deeply into the nature of life is that everything is temporary. Nothing lasts. Things change. The term samsara itself means that which is constantly moving, constantly changing. So recognizing the temporariness, something that the Buddha stressed on it very much, about life being suffering, but also because the temporariness of everything. Now, the moment we know everything is temporary, the easier it will be for us to let go. Because we know when things disappear, things go away, things are destroyed, that was how it was meant to be, because nothing is permanent. So discernment can help us look at life, understand how things occur, separation, death, all of these things, we'll be able to take them in our stride better by this practice of discernment. Again, applying it into real life situations in our own specific life story. And finally, the importance of faith. The Sanskrit word for faith that is often used is shraddha. Although it's translated as faith, shraddha, I sometimes like to refer to it not so much as faith, but as kind of a gut feeling. It's a little bit like someone asks you, do you have faith that God exists? And you say, yes, I have faith in God. When someone says I have faith in God, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have experienced God. That doesn't also imply that they have evidence that God exists. They have no evidence, they have not experienced it, and yet somewhere deep down they know. Again, it's not an intellectual process, it's not been reasoned out. So that kind of a faith is an absolute must for any kind of study. The reason is, any kind of study involves investing a little bit of our time and energy into it. And if we don't have at least enough faith to accept that this study is worth investing my time and energy into, I wouldn't even study it. And so at least any kind of study requires that minimum faith that it's worth investing my time and energy into. And that faith is the beginning of a study of Vedanta in a truest sense of the term. Sometimes when I discuss this with those who self-identify as humanists or atheists, um, and they, in fact, it's kind of sad in some ways that the religions or sometimes are also called faith traditions, and faith is often pitted against as opposite of reason. I think there's a problem there because I think everyone, life would be impossible without faith. Even people who apply reason have faith in the power of reason. Well, what proof do they have that reason is always right? So, I mean, faith really is there everywhere. Even people who deny the existence of God have faith that God doesn't exist. Well, they don't have any proof either that God doesn't exist. So it's not that the burden of proof is always with those who affirm the reality of God. So all that I'm trying to say is the importance of faith is essential in any form of study. So to sum up, when we speak about study of Vedanta, in Vedantic study in the sense in which it has been understood within the tradition cannot be divorced from practice. If I study Vedanta, then knowledge, the word for student in Sanskrit is vidyarthi. Now, arthi means one who wants. Artha, it's something that I value. It's meaningful. So vidyarthi means one who wants vidya, one who wants knowledge. So again, every student going to school will have to ask, am I truly a vidyarthi? Why am I really going to school at all? Why am I even studying? And I'm not sure whether all of us ask that question because many of us just take it as a matter of fact. Well, everyone goes to school, so I have to go to school. That's just what people do. But am I going to school in order to get knowledge? Or all that I want is a degree because I need a degree then to then launch into my career. Then I become more a degree arthi, not so much a vidyarthi. So again, a student would involve wanting knowledge. And knowledge would not simply be something that nourishes just my brain, but something that nourishes my entire being. And for it to nourish and strengthen my whole being, study and practice cannot be separated. So these are a few of the thoughts I wanted to share with you this morning. So we'll have a few questions. So if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, ideas, feel free to ask.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you talked about there being so much information, and you also touched upon like how many of these things are common sense. Hello? Yeah, it's working. Yeah. So you said how we are overexposed to information, and then how some of these teachings are actually common sense. And I feel like it's very easy these days to just read go on the internet, read books, ebooks, and not even have the time to realize that certain things are common sense. So, like, what would you think? What are some practical suggestions in terms of not getting too sucked up into, it's just way too easy to just go on the internet and follow, like even Wikipedia articles, links after links, it's all hyperlinked. It's hard to resist.
Yeah, I think just as it's like overeating can cause indigestion, I think over ingesting of information can cause intellectual indigestion, I think, in some ways. So therefore, I think we have to be judicious in receiving whatever ideas and knowledge we want. Because if we kind of take in more than we can process, it's not going to help. In fact, it's going to hinder our understanding.
Regarding detachment from the fruits of one's actions, I've been working on that with not much success. I've read that the way to do this is by building buddhi, the wisdom part of the mind. By building buddhi, one therefore builds the ability to discriminate between the self and the non-self, and it is that process that allows someone to detach from the fruits of their actions. Is that correct, sir? And could you elaborate?
Yes, thank you for that question. Detaching from the fruits of action, if it involves giving up something that is due to me, something that I value, it's always going to be very difficult. So detachment only when it becomes, well, let me put it this way. Detachment is not so much to be practiced, although I did speak about practicing detachment, it's something that happens on its own. By that I mean, it's difficult to give up the fruits of our actions so long as we value those fruits of our actions. But if the fruits of our actions become less valuable as compared to something else which is more valuable, then detachment from the fruits will automatically occur naturally. And so when in the Gita, for instance, or in Vedantic study, they do speak about giving up the fruits of action. And giving up seems like a negative something, like you're giving up something. What often remains unsaid, but is actually implied, is that when I give up the fruit of action, I'm actually getting a better or more precious fruit. And that would be, oftentimes in Vedanta, they say that's purity of heart. And so when I give up the fruits of the actions that I do, I get a bigger fruit, which actually brings me a greater benefit. So if I remember that by giving up fruits of action, I'm not losing something, I'm actually gaining more, then it should be easy to do. Yeah.
Swamiji, we spoke about practice, and so one question I have is, do you have any tips to assess how one is progressing in that practice? How does one know that we are actually making progress? And so are there some tips to kind of, there's a journaling or whatever? I mean, would love to hear your ideas here.
Yeah, one way of assessing progress is actually comparing ourselves with our own selves. And that is, it might be difficult to know on a day-to-day basis whether I'm a better person today than I was yesterday, but it might be a little easier to look at our own life and say, how I was as a person 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and if I look at my life now, do I think I have become a better human being? And from a spiritual standpoint, that might mean, am I able to deal with my stress, anxiety, anger, whatever issues I had in a more mature way? Do I find a greater stability? Do I find a greater control over my mind, my emotions, a greater clarity and understanding about the deeper questions of life? And I think that kind of a self-assessment would be very helpful. Now, that's not always easy because we often try to either underestimate or overestimate ourselves. And that's why that one story I like very much was one person who had undergone some psychological tests, and then his doctor comes to him and says, "Well, I have good news for you, that from the results of your test, I know that you are not suffering from inferiority complex. You are inferior." So we don't need any complexes. We just need to have a realistic assessment of our own life, and we don't have to publicize the results. So we can be totally brutally frank with ourselves. We recognize what strengths we have, what weaknesses we have, and if we are able to do it in as objective a way as possible, life becomes really easy. It just means then preserving your strengths and trying to eliminate your weaknesses one by one. And if I've done that well, it should not be then that difficult then for me to look at my life and say, well, in the last 2 years, have I been able to overcome or minimize the weaknesses I had? Have I been able to improve upon my strengths? I think that's I feel a more practical way to judge our progress, I think.
Swamiji, you spoke about Viveka, recognizing that everything is temporary. So then, but then, but then the issue I have is, why do even enlightened souls feel grief when, at the loss of something? For example, uh, when uh, when Sri Ramakrishna loses his nephew, I think he next day he feels like, I don't know, a towel was wrung, and something of that sort. And also, even with an avatar like Rama, when he loses Sita, he feels grief. So I was wondering why. Uh, what is the Vedanta explanation for that?
Yeah, well, Swami Vivekananda once said that just to feel to feel grief or joy itself is not a problem, because in order to be enlightened is not same as being like a wall. A wall never feels a grief or joy. So we have a heart, a beating heart. So to feel grief is not any sign that one is less enlightened. What enlightenment means is, can I, sorry, can I get over at will? Do I have enough control over my mind to not have either my grief or my joy overpower me? Both of them are under my control. That's why it's possible for these enlightened ones to be fully human and fully divine at the same time. Otherwise, they wouldn't be recognizable. If they never cry, they never weep, they never feel happy, we won't be able to even relate ourselves to them.
Swamiji, you talked about how things are evidently going to happen, you cannot really change it. Yet in Vedanta, we hear about you are the creator of your own destiny,
Right.
which gives us power. Are these contradictory? I'm sure they are not. Can you explain?
Yes, so that's what I'm saying. So if you are the creator of your own destiny, so when you work hard, you create your future, but that future was what was going to happen. Yeah, it's a little bit like this. And I understand your point. Saying that things will happen, and if I that is not meant to just make me just go and sit in a corner and say, well, there's nothing for me to do because things will happen. Because I mean, it's an easy way to answer it. Well, that was supposed to what was going to happen. You're going to sit in a corner doing nothing. But the idea is that I should do what is right. I should do what is good, and not worry about the results. All of these, the tricky part in study of Vedanta is it's as much possible to understand Vedanta correctly and benefit by it. Unfortunately, many of these teachings are equally possible to totally misunderstand and actually hurt ourselves by it. Which is why oftentimes the tradition insists on having a guidance in spiritual life. Because not understanding something is not as dangerous as misunderstanding it. In fact, in the Upanishad itself, they have, for instance, there is this called Indra Virochana Samvada, the discussion when two students, Indra and Virochana, go to Prajapati, and he gives them the teaching. He says, you are the infinite one, you are the truth. And they both go home, and then Virochana, they think, well, I'm the infinite one. But it's then this Indra who thinks, how can I be the infinite? How can I be the unchangeable truth? The body is completely, it grows, it's perishable. And then he goes back to Prajapati and says, well, this body can't be the infinite and the unchangeable reality. And then the Prajapati says, meditate on it. You are that truth. And then he goes back and says, oh, maybe he meant the mind. And then he again goes at the intellect, and it just kind of, it's the different layers. And ultimately he reaches that truth. Now, a discernment was possible for that student, and because he practiced discernment, he ultimately realized the truth. While the other student just took it at face value, never asked any questions, and never had that, and totally misunderstood it. So So the teaching that everything happens on its own, you will get what you will get, you won't get what you won't get, is not meant to make us feel then that I don't have to do anything. That would be a misunderstanding of that teaching, I think. Yes, even detachment can be misunderstood. Everything properly understood can be helpful. Wrongly understood can be hurting, I think. Yeah.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'll have to cut off questions, I'm sorry. But we'll have time after the session to mingle with all the speakers. So